Hello. For the second set assignment, I chose to do the TED Talk style kind of approach versus writing something out. I decided it'd be great to kind of practice speaking and organizing my thoughts in that way and having the ability to talk through some of the concepts we've been working through in class. So what I chose to do for this assignment was talk a little bit about my favorite communication concept, which was in my intercultural communication class. We talked about intercultural conflict orientations. I took this class, intercultural communication, last spring, 2016, with Dr. Eric Aoki. I'll be kind of referring to the lecture notes that he put together from Martin and Nakayama's book called Intercultural Communication in Contexts, written in 2013. So what I'm going to do today is talk through the orientations, the intercultural conflict orientations, and then I also wanted to compare and contrast my internship experience with the Community Relations Service. They performed facilitation and mediation around conflict for the Department of Justice. They continue to do their work today and are very well known kind of in that realm. And then I also wanted to talk about my experience with the Center for Public Deliberation. I've been eager to kind of compare and contrast these two. I don't think I'm doing this for my long, big project paper anymore, so I wanted to kind of get the chance to infuse that into this short assignment. So what I'll be doing, I'll talk through the orientations to conflict, and then I'll talk about the CRS and how cognizance of these orientations and understanding of these orientations becomes important for their style of facilitation and their values and purposes. And then I'll also connect the orientations to the CPD, their values, and kind of their purpose for what they do, trying to enhance deliberative democracy. And just to start, I would like to say that I recognize there's a lot that can be said about the work that these two organizations do, and I wish that I had time to go into more detail on that. So I definitely want to do these two groups justice. There's a lot of complexities in what they do and the way that they execute the work that they do, and today my purposes are just to connect that work and my experiences with that work to these intercultural orientations, again with the understanding that they do a lot of work and that they do a lot of really good work, and that comes from people who are highly educated and who have kind of figured out theories and ways of executing this work that has proven to be effective for various groups. So I had the chance to present on these conflict orientations with Dr. Eric Aoki at the 2016 Diversity Symposium, and I will be kind of pulling from our notes to discuss these. I really enjoyed this experience. The title of our symposium presentation was When Cultures Clash, Understanding and Negotiating Conflict Orientations, Types, and Styles for Enhanced Intercultural Communication. And as I begin to learn more about facilitation in local democracy and deliberative processes, I really feel it's important to have an enhanced intercultural communication perspective to understand where folks are truly coming from if we want to see decisions being made that are going to impact everyone in a way that's influential and beneficial. So let me talk through those a little bit, and then I'll kind of dive into how they connect to these two organizations. So to begin, there's a few different approaches, and then there's kind of those kind of lend themselves to the different styles. So we have the direct approach of communication when it comes to conflict, which is a view that the best way to deal with conflict is to use precise and specific language. This does generally, kind of according to what we talked about in class, is what is largely used in Europe or by white Americans in the U.S., Australia, New Zealand, those kinds of places. Again, generally, I definitely don't want to make any super strict assumptions about any one particular group in this, but do want to kind of give a little bit of context and example here. The indirect approach is a view that the best way to approach conflict is to use vague and non-specific language. This is definitely viewed as being more kind of appropriate and acceptable in specific cultures. There's the emotional expressiveness approach, a view that the best way to deal with conflict is by overt displays of feeling, and then restraint approach, which is a view that the best way to deal with conflict is by hiding or suppressing feelings and emotions. So let me go a little bit more into kind of combining the approaches, which is what creates the 4 styles of conflict communication orientations. So the first one is a discussion style, which really combines direct and emotional restrained conversations. So comfortable kind of expressing disagreements, but preferred to be emotionally restrained. So kind of say what you mean and mean what you say kind of notion is what we talked about in lecture, and again generally applied to Australian, maybe New Zealand, white Americans, Europeans generally. The engagement style kind of combines direct and emotional expressive approaches. So verbally kind of direct and confrontational approach in dealing with conflict, intense verbal or nonverbal modes, as sincerity and willingness to engage intensely, generally kind of Southern Europeans, and some Russian, maybe Middle Eastern kind of countries, African, Black Americans. So kind of being emotionally expressive, but really being upfront about how they feel, and being very direct kind of in that way. So it differs from the last style in that it's definitely more emotionally expressive. The accommodating style is number 3, and that combines indirect and emotionally restrained kind of conversations. So, as we kind of talked about in lecture and also in this presentation I got to do in the fall, is that people using this style may be ambiguous or more indirect in expressing views. This mode is best so conflict doesn't get out of control kind of in this particular perspective, and generally preferred by Latin Americans, maybe Mexicans, Costa Ricans, and Asians. There's a Swahili proverb that says, silence produces peace and peace produces safety. So silence and avoidance is kind of used to manage conflict in this way, and is kind of seen as being a very valuable kind of mode and something that's very important in dealing with conflict respectfully. The dynamic style combines indirect and emotional expressiveness when it comes to approaching conflict. So people who use this style may use strong language and stories and metaphors, and use third-party intermediaries to become more comfortable with emotionally being kind of confrontational and talking to other people about issues. They view the credibility of the other person grounded in their degree of emotional expressiveness. So that is very highly valued, and to be taken seriously in a conflict moment is to be emotionally expressive, which is completely opposite kind of what's practiced here generally in the United States. So it's just kind of an overview. I think that they're all really interesting, and I've considered them in my daily life ever since I've learned them. So I feel like they're really important, especially as I consider kind of continuing to practice facilitation and community organizing. And I think that they are very complex. Again, there's no surefire way of saying that this person is going to deal with conflict in this way, but I think having the cognizance of these different styles as someone who facilitates or organizes communities becomes very important in understanding how people are responding to and conceptualizing these very important conversations that happen in these small, very intentional groups. So I'd first like to talk about my experience with the Community Relations Service and how I feel that these values and understandings of intercultural communication are incredibly important in the work they do. So they're kind of considered to be the peacemaker of the Department of Justice, and generally kind of confront conflicts and tensions arising from differences of race, color, national origin, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, and disability. They aren't prosecuting anyone, they don't have any law enforcement authority, but are just there to kind of facilitate those conversations and make kind of more peace. Thus, intercultural communication naturally comes up just in thinking about something like difference of national origin. So in my mind, while I didn't really get to do a lot of that work with them specifically, I did do a little bit of observing. But for maybe a white American speaking to someone who came from the Middle East, it becomes important for both sides to understand that their approaches to conflict are different, and that not one person is not inherently right or inherently wrong, but it's just different. I think we talk about that a lot in class. So the agency works with all parties, including state and local units of government, public and private organizations, civil rights groups, and local community leaders to kind of uncover some of these underlying interests. And I think that it becomes increasingly important for people who are facilitating these conversations to understand the different kind of styles. And so I think for a facilitator to have this understanding could really mean that they could bring those up in conversations of, maybe almost use that as a way of framing how this conversation will go and understanding that we're all coming from different perspectives. Moving on to the CPD. So I think that the CPD, their mission is slightly different in that they're looking to, in my experience, kind of enhance community dialogues around different issues, and not necessarily that, from my experience, it hasn't been that we go into these spaces with the intentions of resolving a conflict, which the CRS, that is kind of the purpose, but more just for the purposes of enhancing dialogue around tough issues. I think it still calls into question, consideration for the different ways people are perceiving and understanding conflict. So diversity comes up as something that is important. Kind of this main question is, how do we best address public problems in a diverse democracy? And I think that diversity is really spelt out pretty word for word in the CRS value statement, but not so much for the CPD. So I've understood diversity in this context, in diversity in, things like race, national origin, all of those things come up, identity differences, but I also think that they come up in regards to ways of thinking, or the left versus the right, or religious ideals. I think that those things come up a little bit more kind of in work with the CPD. So therefore diversity perhaps is a little bit broader, and it's hard to say that intercultural communication then has the same meaning in this context. So more general in regards to diversity, but still that notion of diversity and difference that is the same, even though they aren't solely focusing on conflicts that come up because of those differences, but they're prepared to talk about them should they arise. So I think it is important that the students in the CPD have an idea of intercultural conflict and what that means, just to not necessarily to have to know exactly what people from different parts of the world are thinking, as that might not be a prominent or central focus of any given discussion, but just to kind of go in with that recognition that everyone here is not going to be thinking about this the same way as I am, whether that person be from, the facilitator might be from Latin America, the facilitator might be from the US, which is highly likely. So just kind of going in with that understanding that not everyone is going to be conceptualizing the same thing. The CPD also talks about how it involves talking with a representative group of informed, engaged people who come together to utilize good information. And I think that this representative, that word really sticks out to me. In creating these representative groups, there is some responsibility that falls on the shoulders of the facilitator. And so for this group to truly be representative, it's kind of the facilitator's job to define the space as such. In the handbook, under kind of the big picture, what is public deliberation, there's a subsection that talks about deliberative politics. And specifically, one sentence really sticks out to me, which I think connects to the importance of recognition of intercultural communication and its importance. It says, often working with facilitators or process experts who utilize a variety of deliberative techniques, citizens come together to consider relevant facts and values from multiple points of view, listen to one another in order to think critically about the various options before them, consider the underlying tensions, tough choices, and varied consequences inherent to addressing public problems. So how we approach conflict being one of those points of views or differences that the facilitator can acknowledge right off the bat and kind of setting up these conversations. So, since our class is kind of built around this idea of tensions, and I know, Martine, you've talked about that's kind of how your mind works, is what are the tensions, and kind of bringing up this need for facilitators in different organizations to have a understanding of intercultural competence and communication regarding conflict. I think that there are some inherent tensions. So I think whether or not to have facilitators train in intercultural communication styles for both of these organizations is met by the argument that we are in the United States and that they should rely on those engaging in conflict to understand kind of this American way of communicating conflict, which, as discussed, is generally kind of that discussion style, so very direct and emotionally restrained. So kind of recognizing that that is in itself a tension. Should we expect people to kind of understand this mode for communicating about conflict? Or, I might argue that there is this need to understand conflict orientations, because I think that without that, we can't truly have this inclusive, enhanced conversation around tough issues. So why is this concept particularly useful? I would say just in the workforce generally. For our class, we're about to go out into the world, and it's becoming increasingly globalized and diverse. And so having the ability to work with coworkers even on an interpersonal level, and to understand that we're coming from different kind of places around the world, different experiences, again, getting kind of stepping into someone else's shoes and out of the ethnocentric way of thinking, is going to lend itself to a lot of productivity in regards to how conflict can be dealt with. So, for instance, I work at Subway, and not only do I talk with people who are from places all over the globe every single day just in that context, Subway is also international, so the people working with that company on a corporate level have to understand how people from different cultures are communicating about maybe different concerns or things that are going well. And I think just, again, going out into the world, recognizing that everyone thinks about conflict differently, and therefore their approach is highly influenced by, kind of cultural practices and norms, is just an important thing to have in our head as we kind of begin to work with people more in professional settings, perhaps, in organizational settings. And even just that cognizance can be a really important tool. As people who graduate with communication studies degrees, I think we need to be relied on and should be able to handle being relied on for some of this work. People should be able to look to us as people who can say, I understand the basics of communication and how that can change from place to place and culture to culture. So we must be well researched and confident in our abilities to intentionally and inclusively communicate. In the More Than a Major report that we talked about in class, employers say colleges should place varying degrees of emphasis on kind of selected learning outcomes, and one of those is knowledge about cultural diversity in America and in other countries. So I think that definitely applies to this again. Being able to have these skills in the workplace and understanding and using our communication degree in that way. So just to kind of wrap things up, again, just going back to the importance of this really valued communication concept for me of intercultural conflict styles and orientations, and applying those to different settings. I particularly applied them to my experience with the Community Relations Service and to my experience with the CPD. I kind of spelled out the differences in their values and missions, but I think that the way that this knowledge should be applied is very similar, and that it kind of falls on the facilitator to have the cognizance and understanding of these differences in effort to create a more representative and open space for people who are there to participate in really important issues. And I think this also ensures that people are more heard and more understood, kind of beyond maybe not having knowledge or understanding of these different conflict orientations. Again, this can all be applied directly to kind of this next stage of our lives, communicating in cultural settings such as, different organizations, or maybe it is in some place other than the United States. So having this information and knowledge can be applied in those ways as well. Thank you for taking the time and listening in, and I look forward to learning more about facilitation and intercultural communication and the ways that they intersect and work to enhance one another.